Musical theory is so confusing. Very often my students are puzzled by how it works, and I decided to clear the way from all the questions and doubts that you might have. This is Alberto, you are in the London Contemporary School of Piano, and today we're going to talk about the best way to understand harmony in classical and jazz. If you're a fan of the work that we do at the London Contemporary School of Piano, make sure you head over to our website, contemporaryschoolofpiano.com. You'll find a link to our free resource kit. There's plenty of things to learn and to try out at the piano. I love to share my knowledge on videos, but I love also to teach one-to-one, face-to-face. So consider getting in touch to have personal lessons with me, the studios in London. As I was saying, the math in musical theory doesn't always add up. It's quite confusing, especially if you're trying to cross from classical to jazz or the other way around, from jazz harmony to classical harmony. Why there are so many rules, why most of the time the rules are broken, and how come sometimes the principle that I learned, for example, in classical harmony don't apply as well in jazz harmony and vice versa. Just to give you a quick example, how come if this is the scale of C, how come C7 involves a B flat? Right? C7 should involve a B. This is, and many other things we're going to talk about today. Let's get started. I first want to set up the source of the confusion. We need to understand that musical theory is extracted from practice, emerges from tradition, which means that depending on which tradition we are looking at, we're going to encounter a different set of practices that in the course of time will develop principles and best practices and perhaps even theoretical principle behind it. In Europe, musical theory started becoming important and relevant for composers and musicians, especially during the Enlightenment, so between the 16 and 1700, which means many centuries after practices and techniques were already being used. Which means that they had already had a few centuries of tradition on which to base their old theoretical principles. On top of that, let's consider that in 16 and 1700, the music in Europe was not one of the many styles of music. It was the main style of music. There wasn't music coming from America, really. There wasn't really music coming from any other part of the world. And they were particularly proud of their style. So the theory onto which our fundamental understanding of musical theory is based on today is was crafted in a period where the style was dominant. This word will come back in a bit in a completely different meaning. To wrap up, the theory that we are using today has strong ties with a style of music, the style of music of the 16 and 1700. And if we go even a step farther, things can be made even more confusing by the fact that at the time from the 17 and even to the 1800, you'll have different theorists arguing what is the right way. So nowadays we find ourselves in this very, let's say, confusing environment where you go to school and you learn that you can't have parallel fifths when moving chords, but then there is no modern genre of music that does it very freely, happily, it uses parallel fifths. How about chord nomenclature and what is the difference between naming a chord with a letter or naming a chord with a Roman numeral, and why would that be relevant? So this is the situation, and let's get started with the first question. For example, why a dominant chord of C is with a B flat and not with a B? This is confusing for everyone in the beginning. Let's take a couple of steps back. If we know that the scale of C is all the white keys, the seventh note of the scale of C is B natural. So the confusing part is that if I see on my chord chart a C with a 7, I will be inclined to go up to B natural, to count from C. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Effectively, this is not the right way of playing a C7 chord. We have to therefore introduce a couple of more informations. First, the theory of intervals. This is not going to be a huge side note, but we need to study chords through the lenses of the intervals in which they are created, which they are constructed. So, for example, in the case of a C major, we have a major third, a minor third, and a perfect fifth. Okay? In the theory of intervals, we have major intervals such the third and minor intervals like this. A fifth cannot be major nor minor. A fifth is either perfect or augmented and diminished. Then what about the seventh? Can the seventh be major or minor? Yes, effectively it can. So this is a major 7 and this is a minor 7. The sound is particularly interesting, but we'll come back to the reason why they're called major or minor later. We need to appreciate the fact that depending on the style of music, composers or musicians, instrumentalists, performers might prefer to use this sound or that sound. So, in the case of the music emerging in America in the late 1800s, early 1900s, what sound would they preferring? Well, probably this one. The major chord with minor 7. As a matter of fact, if you think of gospel and blues, very often, most of the time, we're talking about major chord with minor 7 all the way through. These are all major chords. These are all major chords with minor 7. But then this is confusing because, of course, a major chord with a minor 7 in classical theory, in European classical theory, turns out to be the dominant chord of the scale of F. Well, this is very confusing because the blues in C will have this chord, but that means that we are not in C. Oh man, what are we talking about? So the key for me to understand and to appreciate the difference between harmony in one style and the other, it is in the fact that it's the style that determines what is good and what is not the theory. In classical harmony, this chord has a function, and in blues, this chord has a different function. And so we can therefore introduce the concept of functional harmony, perhaps the most rich and interesting topic of all. I've been a nerd in functional harmony. I have spent years analyzing it, using functional harmony to analyze music, and I've learned a big deal with it. I especially learned that functional harmony cannot explain everything. So by functional harmony, we simply mean that given a particular set of keys, for example, the scale of C major, we encounter a different set of chords, a different set of harmonies using these 7 notes. And even if we know how to describe each chord, C major, D minor, E minor, this set of chords can be identified with Roman numerals. Why do I need to identify them with Roman numerals? Because if I understand that the scale of C major is built in the same way a scale of B flat major is built, or in the same way an A major scale is built, I realize that within the context of a major scale, the role of the first chord is the same. Okay? I'm gonna say this again. Functional harmony allows me to treat chords according to the role that they have in the tonal context that they are in. For example, the chord of C has function number 1 in the key of C, but has function number 4 in the key of G. So but now the chord of C will turn out to sound quite different if I change the key. Okay. What do I mean by that? What do I mean sounding different? Well, initially when I started playing, the chord of C was the home. Now G is the home, and the chord of C is a side one, is a less heavy chord. So functional harmony is this world in which I identify the function of each chord given the tonal context that we are in. And by tonal context, of course, I mean the key that we are in, whether we are in C major, in B flat, in G major, etc. If you're a fan of the work that we do at the London Contemporary School of Piano, make sure you head over to our website, contemporaryschoolofpiano.com. You'll find a link to our free resource kit. There's plenty of things to learn and to try out at the piano. I love to share my knowledge on videos, but I love also to teach one-to-one, face-to-face. So consider getting in touch to have personal lessons with me, the studios in London. Okay, now, does functional harmony works in a style like the blues or gospel? Well, probably to some extent. Certainly, it doesn't work if we consider this chord a 5. This is a 5, a dominant chord, only if thinking about it in functional harmony terms. But in the blues, this is a 1. That's a 4. That's a 1. Makes sense? Because the style tells us it does, and the tradition and our experience with blues and modern styles definitely tells us that there's nothing wrong about it. But we need to pay attention that the terms by which we describe this music might be very confusing, exactly because a unified theory is overlapping regardless the styles of music. But as we are learning, it's the style of a particular music that tells us whether the theory makes sense or not. Another question that I'm asked is why should I learn harmonic rules if effectively every piece of music I encounter constantly breaks those rules? This is a beautiful question, effectively the core question of artistic creativity. Theory is in music is the one thing that allows you to interpret what's on the paper or what's in the music. It's not necessarily the only way to go about creatively. As a matter of fact, every great artist in the history of music, but also in the history of art, I argue, has always used the rules to a certain point beyond which those rules were broken. And it was necessary to break those rules. Effectively, it is necessary to break the rules once we understand what the purpose of that rule is. Particularly, I mentioned earlier, consecutive fifths. In Baroque music, to play something like this is wrong. And the reason why it's wrong is because this is unacceptable for the style. Why? The style that this rule comes from is choral style. So this particular rule applies to a style of music that is not the piano, is not the rock guitar. So it is pointless to say that consecutive fifths are not allowed. Are not allowed if we are applying these rules in the context of choral music, in a classical style. But if we employ these movements in a modern rock tune, it's totally allowed. So there's no problem right here. So as I was saying earlier, the evolution of theory develops and follows the evolution of style. And in Europe, we have seen styles of music that have developed throughout almost a millennia. Each stage was characterized by composers and theorists defending their style as the ultimate style, as the correct one. But what happens in the last 150 years? Of course, we had a cross-contamination between a number of cultures, and if we look at the West, certainly the musical contamination between America and Europe was great, was huge, and so it started becoming a bit confusing to use the same word, theoretical language, and vocabulary to describe styles of music that are wildly different. And throughout the years, I think I've learned that in Europe, the theory that we have developed has become normative. We go to school and we learn how to write music in that style is necessary for you to express yourself within the cultural context of Europe. And it is kind of necessary that you learn those fundamental basic vocabulary for you to say anything, even when you will be breaking the rules and in creating your own rules. But we culturally, I think, we find necessary to relate to the style from the very beginning. Composers of the 19th century, contemporary composers in Europe, were most of the time, if not all the time, very much experts on classical styles too. But then, crossing the Atlantic, you see that there is much more than one style in music. We have blues, rock, jazz, reggae, rockabilly, rock and roll, and we have country, folk, we have pop, all sorts. Is it possible that perhaps one unified theoretic system doesn't apply to everything? Of course it is possible. Nevertheless, if we're using the same notation, then things become confusing. What a chord symbol might mean depend on the style in which one wants to play. And so, as I was saying earlier, in Europe, perhaps the theory was a way to make the writing, the creative, normative. Perhaps you can make this distinction. In Europe, the musical theory had a normative function, while in America, very generally, and depending on style, on the genre, but theory has more a descriptive function. You are effectively free to create your own rule and make music the way you like. Theory helps you understanding what you have done and perhaps develop it further, but there is no necessity to follow it strictly. This is quite interesting. It speaks also about culture, something that I'm personally interested in. So let's get back to a previous point we were making about major and minor. In this idea, we will find an answer to a few doubts. I'm thinking about the difference between major and minor and how they apply to a chord. When we look at a C major chord, we are distinguishing between the third when it's major and third when it's minor, defining effectively the mode of the chord. Remember this term, the mode of the chord. In this case, the mode is major, and in this case, the mode is minor. Now, earlier I was telling you that not only the third can be major or minor, but also the seventh too. Well, we learned that a major third sounds happy and a minor third sounds sad, which tells us a little bit about where this term comes from. Major probably sounds large, sounds great, sounds grand, sounds positive. Yes, positive and happy, while minor maybe refers to something smaller, darker, sad, minus. And so we make all this association. We have made all of this association in the past when we have decided to call two different modes as major and minor. But effectively, these qualities, for example, positive and negative, have lost meaning with regard to the major 7 or the minor 7. This is not happy and this is not sad. Effectively, there are other intervals that we can call major and minor. For example, the 6th. This has a little bit of happy and sad. But what about the second? This is major. This is minor. This is very happy. So major and minor used to define the mode of an interval, and now they are descriptive of the distance between the notes, the interval between the notes, whether it's large or small. The interval can be major, large, or minor and small. This is quite crucial and quite confusing, because then we learn that a C7, such as this, is a combination of two different information. The C has a mode, in this case C is major. The seventh has a mode, in this case is minor. So it can be, to some of you, can be revelating. I know for some of my students it has been, when I pointed out that when we encounter a chord symbol that has a 7 or a 9th or an 11 or a 13, we need to make a proper distinction between the mode of a chord and the mode of a 7. Okay, now we are discovering another point of debate. Why 7 is this and not that? Number 7 as a minor, interval of minor 7, should be pointed out, should be written out, minor 7 or major 7. Why number 7 by itself identifies the minor? Well, this can be only answered in terms of the style that these chords refer to. Effectively, this nomenclature, chord symbols, didn't come from straightly from Europe, but came from the other side, came from US. And this chord was the default chord used for example, a style like blues or rock and roll, meaning very possibly the instrumentalist, the musician of the time, tended to just write a C and write a 7, meaning this sound, not this. Imagine a blues played with major 7. It's not bad, but it sounds so weird. Now let's play with minor 7. Sounds much better. So by default, the 7 has come to mean minor 7 simply because the style required it, even though there is no really clearly theoretical explanation for it. Certainly we can't find it in functional harmony. And then final point, we have talked about modes, major and minor. And I'm sure some of you are either familiar or at least acquainted with the idea of modality. How is it that we talk about modality and modes when we talk about major and minor? Just put your nose into the area, into the topic of modality. It can be very complicated, but there are many more modes than two. And this is something that I've learned just by studying history. Think about the temper system, the 12 equal semitones in which our octave is subdivided. This didn't come from the sky. We developed it, we built it slowly. And if you look at the 1200 or 1300 and you wonder what scale did we have over there at the time? Well, we had the hexatone, a scale made of 6 tones. Particularly, these were the tones. Later on, we've added a half a step there and a half a step there, making into a scale of 7/8. By the way, there are places, I'm thinking of Germany, perhaps even Russia too, correct me if I'm wrong, where there is still today there is a distinction between the B and a B flat. The B flat is called B, while the B natural is called H. Why is that? Because the B and the B flat are variations, are adjustment of the initial hexatone. But then let's continue. Once we had the 7 notes and we have decided to adjust the octave into this perfectly measured 12 semitone split, then we have multiplied the possibility to move around the keys. We have created a lot more keys that are possible to play in. And within a single key, we have realized that we can play exactly the same notes, but if we move the center, if we move the origin, the tonal, the home tone, the whole sound of the key will shift slightly. For example, this is clearly in C major. I'm using all the notes of C major, but it doesn't sound like C major, does it? And C doesn't seem to have particular importance. This is quite interesting and it's also confusing. So I'm playing right now in a mode of D minor. The mode is called Dorian. Now, this is still C major, but we are not exactly in C major. We are playing in a mode. But wait a minute, Alberto, earlier you were saying the modes are major and minor. Yes, they are. And if we play the game of constructing a mode out of all the notes of C major, we encounter 7 different modes. 4, 5, 6, 7. Each mode has its own name, and you can find music written in each of these modes. In the 1700, the style of the time, the musicians of the time knew this very well. They were perfectly familiar with this idea, and they were exploring all sorts of modes. But at the time, they have made a sort of artistic decision, cultural, stylistic decision. They kind of all agreed that fundamentally the two most interesting modes, the ones that are right to use, at least right at the time for them, were just two: the first mode and the sixth mode. Effectively the Ionian and the Aeolian. Why they established these two? Possibly because these two modes were strong enough in their expressive character. One was particularly happy and the other was particularly sad, and good enough in their relationship, their contrast. Contrast was something that the musician of the Baroque period was very important. And so it is clear now how the major mode and the relative minor mode became the two main currencies in which music of the 1600 and 1700 and later periods became established. Minor. Major again. And this is pretty simple. Our ear is very well accustomed to this sound, but effectively this is the result of a, I would say, not natural selection, but stylistic selection. In the 1600 or 1700, theorists were making the case for only the mode from the first note and the mode from the sixth note. If you're a fan of the work that we do at the London Contemporary School of Piano, make sure you head over to our website, contemporaryschoolofpiano.com. You'll find a link to our free resource kit. There's plenty of things to learn and to try out at the piano. I love to share my knowledge on videos, but I love also to teach one-to-one, face-to-face. So consider getting in touch to have personal lessons with me, the studios in London. Okay, as you see, what I've been discussing so far with regard to the modes proves that modality effectively predates tonality. The tonality of C major or A minor are the surviving ones. Earlier, before this idea of tonality, we had much more room for experimentation through different modes. but the classical style and the theory that we have built around it was strongly dependent on this idea of tonality, and functional harmony depends once again on this idea of tonality. More than that, is built on this idea of tonality. So I hope this cleared the way, perhaps gave you an answer to a few burning questions around harmony. As a teacher, I found that a lot of students coming from one style and going into another find themselves often confused by theoretic nomenclature, by functional harmony, and why this is important. I think it's very important, but it's also less important for the purpose of playing and appreciating music than we think. Theory is not the answer to our piano challenges or our piano difficulties, but theory might help us appreciating or following more what's happening in the ear. So my strongest recommendation for you would be study as much theory as necessary for you to play better, to enjoy more the music that you play. Final little interesting point. Have you noticed in musical theory that a third, 3, plus a 6 gives an 8? How is it possible? Musical theory, 3 plus 6, 6 does 8. And I'm going to leave you with this conundrum to think about. Thank you for listening, and see you the next time.